Hello, this video we're gonna make the particle better. So previously here I made the setup, so we have our mesh shooting and also we have a texture on that as well. Now before we start, I want to enable certain feature in Unity that I will use. So here if we go to Edit, Preferences, we have a option Visual Effects and to enable experimental operations. So we can here load in experimental nodes in our system. So the main thing that I'm interested in is going to particle update and pressing space there. If we type in events, we now have events to trigger other particles. So for example, when this particle dies, we will spawn a explosion. So I'm going to start with that. So here we have the particle flying, and when it dies, we will then have the explosion. So maybe I shorten the lifetime a bit here to 0.5, so it's like faster dies. So here we will see particles spawning. So now how do we use this trigger event? So from here I can branch out to another particle network, and we're going to use a GPU event here. So GPU event. So from there we can then spawn things. So of course we need an initializer. Then when we have the initializer, we need to have the particle update. And once we have that, we then need to have a quad output. So just a normal quad output here. So normally here you will probably see nothing. And that is because we need to set a lifetime. So let's set a lifetime. We can do maybe a random lifetime. So let's set this from 0.2 to 1. So that's good enough. And what you can see now is almost nothing. I don't really see anything. But if I take a closer look at my original spawn here, I can actually see a particle spawning here. So what happens is when the particle dies, it will spawn at 0.0 a new particle. So what we need to do is we need to ask the position from where it is. So we're going to use a node here called inherit source position. And now if we look closely, we can see a small particle here appearing. So of course we want to have more of them, maybe make them a bit bigger. So what we can do is we can also add a velocity. So velocity, and I'm going to use the from direction and speed with random. So here random, set this to random as well, and we can go from 5 to 8, and then you can see a few particles spawning. They're quite small here. So here we're gonna add a new node. We're gonna set the scale, the size over the lifetime, so over life. So we can make this really big and then they go small again. So we have like a little explosion here. So what we can do to spawn more is we can go here to the trigger event, and this is the count. So if I increase this count value, we will actually spawn more of them. So since this area is quite small to read, I'm gonna just place down a integer over here. And let's fill in, for example, 1000. Let's see how that looks like. So that's already quite a lot more. You can even go way higher, like 50,000. This is way more. You can also see that the orientation is also not fully working yet of the particles. So let's actually go back to my output here, and we're gonna type in orient and then along camera here. So we can change this to along velocity or camera. So now there should be like camera facing. That's better. We can also here, of course, change the texture, and we can use a default particle texture from Unity. So just this one. Then we can, for example, here set color over live, so with the gradient, and we can make this go from orange to a red color, so red. What we can also do is, since we have the HDR enabled, we can increase the intensity. So when it explodes, we have like this huge white value. But this is of course too much, but you get the idea here. Like this looks a bit more like an explosion. We can also use this node and set the color here for my original. So I can just copy paste this in over here. And you can see that when my particle starts, it's already flashing. You can still later on, of course, play around with this, as this is a quite flexible way of working. So that is the very base setup. We can still do some more things here in, for example, the update particle. So we can add some linear drag. We can, for example, increase this to 3. We can also add some gravity if you want to like to let them fall down. So now they're like more falling down. Maybe like have like a subtle gravity, so -3 maybe. So it's a bit more subtle. And the next thing that I want to do, and where Houdini comes in, is I want to control a bit on how this looks. And I want to use a vector field force. So we can generate vector fields in Houdini and plug that in over here. So the vector field is just a field of vectors, and based on where the particle is, it will follow along that vector direction. Something that I also forgot to mention is here at the top, we are limiting ourselves with the current capacity. This is the total amount of spamming particles. So since I set a pretty high value here, we probably are limiting the particle anyway by this value. So if I want to have quite a lot of particles, so let's say 10,000, you will see that we will now have way more particles spamming here. So now let's go to Houdini, and I want to show you how we did the vector fields. So here in Houdini, we already have a setup, and this is also currently here a visualizer to seeing a vector field. So these lines are following a certain volume based on the vectors. So this is the volume, and they each have like a specific direction where the particles will go. Now, one more important thing, to get actually the sample file, Unity has made some VFX tools that you can get on GitHub. So here on GitHub, look for VFXToolbox, and this will include some Houdini tools to generate, for example, this vector field. So I can highly recommend you using this. So there are some more things in here, but the main thing we are looking for is the Houdini integration. So we can export point caches, and we can also export here a volume exporter. So this is what I'm going to use here for the vector field. So when you're downloading this, you will also have the same scene that I had in Houdini. So these examples that you see here are all from GitHub, and here I made some of my own. So for example, if I want to have the Houdini logo as my vector field, I'm able to do that. So the way I did this is, first of all, I made here this volume, and this is basically copied from what we have here from GitHub. So we have these nodes. So first of all, we just create a volume. We can name it velocity. We can give it like certain specific settings. And then we're gonna use a VOP to straighten this out. So here is a quick look at the VOP. And furthermore, I'm gonna mix this volume with the Houdini logo. So here I have a Houdini logo. So this is built-in Houdini in the lab tools. And I'm just like matching this in the world, also setting it to 111 in size. And then I'm going to create a volume for the x-axis, the y, and the z. So I know that each axis has a volume there, because I know that this is also outputting 3 velocity, so I try to keep that consistent. So here we have then the volume merging, and I'm just multiplying those two together. So basically, if we look here at this volume, if we have the bounds, we see that we have a lot of empty space. So when we multiply them together with this, it will basically multiply by 0, which will return nothing. So we have basically our logo with the noise in there. So the noise is useful because if I view my volume here, so volume previous, I can see that my Houdini logo will have this specific direction where particles will go. So if I would spawn this, my particles will fly in this certain direction. Then for exporting, we have this nodes. This was built by Unity and this is from GitHub. So by default, it will automatically export. So we are exporting a vector field. We can give it a proper name, and we are looking for the volume called velocity, of course. So in here we have the volume velocity. So whenever I click here on this icon, it will now render this out or export this out. It will also give a pop-up here saying that the export is done. So here I have imported this file and we can already start assigning that here. So that's already set up. So now to sort of like visually see our effects, I'm actually going to disable here the inherit source position. So we can actually start working here in the middle here. We only have this. Then when I click on my vector fields, we can see that this is the area where our vector fields will be affected. So if I increase this a lot here, you can see that our particles are sort of like flying that certain direction based on the vector field. Now I want to make this vector field a bit bigger, so let's say 5 by 5 by 5. You can see that we have even more stranger effects going on. The higher you crank these values up, they will go in this more specific way, as you could see. Now, if we want to do something really specific like this logo, I can actually recommend you not to use this velocity one, and I'm gonna just use like a box emitter. So a box emitter. And this box emitter will basically be the same size of my vector field. So I'm also gonna fill in 5, 5, 5. And you can also see that this is giving me sort of this weird result. I would also sometimes switch here to actually signed instead of the unsigned normalized, and you'll see that this will like stay a bit better in place here at the moment. So we can see that we have actually the middle is working. So this is actually where we had the volume, and this was like an empty space in my Houdini scene. So we can actually just simply like stretch this out. So if I press 0 and put in like 30, we can start seeing our Houdini logo now. So if you look closely, we can steadily see our logo in here. Now, one other thing I can do is the box spawn here doesn't have to be this width, so we can also make this smaller. And now we are able to see our logo much better. So here again, my lifetime is set to 1, so it's like a really quickly gone. So we can definitely see that we have like this Houdini logo in there. So you can use anything like a logo or just like a random noise. You can just play around with this. It can be really cool. This is how we can get specific logo, but we can also just use like a curl node. So I quickly exported here some noise here. And you can see that this is a little bit stretched, and that is because of course here I went crazy on these values. So I'm just gonna fill in 5 back again, so it's like evenly. And you can see like we have this squirrel noise. Of course, we can also play around with the scale. So we can set this quite high, so 20, 20, 20, like so. And then we can just like are scaling up this effect, so maybe this is better for my explosion. So since we are using like this curl noise and not a specific logo, we can, for example, disable the position here, and we can go back here to sort of like that velocity that was shooting out of it. And then we have here something like this. So that looks pretty cool. And we can always like tweak these values, so maybe the scale was too much here. Also, inherit position is also back on. So we can always go on the side here and start making things. So for example, if I want to control the scale with one value, we can just grab a float and we can bring that in here. So now we can control this by just one value. And I think this is a bit better. It's also cool effect here, cool shapes. So if you have downloaded these project files, these demo files, you basically have a lot of different noises to try out, like Perlin noise, curly noise, vortex noise, and certain other effects. You can just do a lot of different things with just vector fields. Now, one more thing we can do here as well is we can add a trail. So this was the explosion part, and we can now quickly add, for example, a trail here. So we can spawn another event, and we can just do, for example, a certain event that's always triggering or a certain rate. So we can try out the rate here. We could decide to, for example, just copy this, and let's just copy this and see what that will give us. So bring it in over here. And you can see that we are like spamming these little particles. So again, we can bring in a float here. So this is the float. And this is controlling how much or how often this would trigger to spam. So we can set this maybe to 200. And you can see that we have some nice particles going after this. So we have like it's sort of like a trail effect. This is also using that vector field. So we can also play around here with the scaling to get different effects. We can also here increase maybe the gravity so they actually fall on the ground. If we're interested in, for example, also adding colliders, we can just do an update particle. We can just type in collider. We can have certain colliders here. We can use a basic collider here, like a box. And this is then my collider. I can place it here in my scene and drag this out like so. So I have now this basic collider. Maybe increase here the lifetime of my particles, let's say from 3 to 10, so I actually can see them falling on the ground. Maybe this vector field is too intense, so start lowering some values here. That's better. And as you can see, we now have them colliding with the box here. We can of course play around here with, for example, the bounce, like let them bounce on the ground here. I think maybe a bit of bouncing could be nice. And that's basically it for this particle. So the only thing left is to actually do a simulation. So you can still like play around with this, tweak some values, adding some more effects. It's just the base setup to get the effect. And we can always just go back and tweak values. So I hope you enjoyed this video and thank you for watching.